A little more than a year ago, I started an effort within Congress called the Article 1 Project, or the A1P, as we sometimes refer to it. It's an in-house, internal, bicameral think tank within Congress designed to get at this question of who is speaking when it comes to the law. The premise of the Article 1 Project is simple, and it goes back to the fact that over the last 80 years, Congress has gradually, steadily, but rather willfully abdicated its role as the lawmaking body within the federal government. And it does matter who's speaking when we make the law. This, by the way, has happened under Congresses, under Senates, and under White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination. I don't mean to say that both parties have done it in exactly the same way, but I will say that members of both parties have eagerly contributed to the problem. And the problem relates to excessive delegation of the lawmaking power. Not just a little bit of delegation, but a whole lot of delegation, to the point that one can scarcely recognize which branch of government is actually making the law. And in fact, if we're being fair, if we're being honest, we've got one branch that is making the most law by far, and it's not the legislative branch. To be sure, we're not the victims here. We in Congress are, in fact, the perpetrators, but I'll get more into that a little bit later. Article 1 of the Constitution states in no uncertain terms. In fact, it states this in the very first clause of the very first section of the first article of the Constitution, that all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. The framers of the Constitution understood really well that Congress would predominate over the other two branches of government. This was done quite by design, because they understood that Congress would be the branch of the federal government most accountable to the people and at the most regular intervals. That's why in Federalist 48, James Madison explained this point by saying, quote, "The legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex." I always enjoy it whenever the words impetuous and vortex can appear side by side like that. And yet I've found that they appear side by side nowhere other than Federalist 48. That's why I quote it whenever I get the chance. For the first 100 years or so of our republic, this basically worked. It was followed. In fact, it was followed instinctively. It was not something that Congress ever had much of a desire to depart from, because Congress was doing what most, at the time of the founding, expected Congress would do, jealously guarding its own power. So Congress made the laws, and the executive branch enforced the laws. That's how it worked. But then in the early part of the 20th century, as the so-called progressive theory of government gained traction, the strict separation of powers contemplated by the Constitution, and in fact prescribed by it, began to be undermined. By the time of his first inaugural address, President Franklin Roosevelt was able confidently and happily to announce that the Constitution should be changed. He announced that the Great Depression itself had created, quote, a set of circumstances that should be treated, quote, as we would treat the emergency of war, and that, quote, it may be that an unprecedented demand and need for undelayed action may call for a temporary departure from the normal balance of public procedure, close quote. Well, as it turns out, FDR's departure from the constitutional order would be anything but temporary. And the United States has been steadily departing from that normal balance ever since then.